As requested, here's my list for the 10 best players in the history of Seattle professional sports. Real quick though, before we do get to the list, if at any point you find yourself enjoying this video and you happen to be the kind of person who likes to enjoy things, then do feel free to do us both a favor and hit that subscribe button down below. And also, as this particular video was actually requested by a subscriber, if you yourself have any ideas of videos you might like to see me do in the future, do feel free to leave those down in the comment section below, and if I like them, I'll try to get to them. Now, as we do get into the list, this is going to be just limited to the big four sports in North America, so in Seattle's case, that is just the Seahawks, Mariners, and of course Sonics. But as we do get into the honorable mentions, I do want to mention Sue Bird, who is definitely one of the best WNBA players of all time, and I've heard that Clint Dempsey for the Sounders is also pretty good, so I'll leave him in there as well. Some other honorable mentions that didn't quite make this list include Richard Sherman, Cam Chancellor, Earl Thomas, Kenny Easley, Cortez Kennedy, Randy Johnson, Sean Kemp, Gus Williams, and I probably could have thrown in a couple of other players from that '79 championship Sonics team. And of course, Ray Allen. And for a lot of these guys, part of the reason they didn't make this list is that a big factor that I took into consideration is how long that they played in Seattle specifically, as this list is about Seattle athletes. At number 10, Hall of Famer Jack Sikma. Sikma was drafted 8th overall in 1977 and played 715 games in Seattle over 9 years. And right out of the gate, he had an immediate impact on the Sonics, helping the team to the 1978 NBA Finals in his rookie season. And although they would lose those finals to the Bullets, he would help lead the team back to the NBA Finals the very next year and on to victory over those very same Bullets, winning Seattle's first and so far only NBA title. In that second season, he would also earn his way to the first of what would eventually be 7 consecutive All-Star Game appearances, a stretch that included the 1981-82 season in which he was also named an NBA All-Defensive Player, a year that included him having almost 10 defensive rebounds alone per game. Sikma was a brilliant defensive player throughout his time with the Sonics, averaging more than a block and a steal per game, as well as 8.3 defensive rebounds and 10.8 total rebounds per game. But what he was most known for, and where he left his lasting mark on the NBA, was on the offensive side. He helped redefine the role of the big man and is one of the early players that set the example for what the center position now looks like in the NBA. Throughout his career, he was an excellent shooter, especially for a center with a field goal percentage of .464, and this was due in large part to his unique shooting style and his revolutionary way of setting up his shots. His 6'11 frame and over-the-head shooting style meant that it was very difficult for most players to block his shots already, but what really set him apart was what would become known as the Sikma move.
Back to Gus, baseline to Sikma, he won't miss that in a month, he won't. 18-footer, he was up, not close, rebound to Sikma, pull down pass to Mc.
When being guarded, instead of pivoting to the outside to set up his shot, Sikma would pivot to the inside, creating more space between him and the defender and setting up for that more open shot. And if the defender did decide to step up and close up that space, Sikma would just slip right past them and either take an open shot or drive to the rim.
Jack. Nice bucket for Jack, about 9 feet out on the baseline. He's got 8 points.
It was a combination that gave him the reputation throughout the league of being literally impossible to block a shot from. Sikma would eventually leave Seattle and play out his final 5 years in Milwaukee, where he eventually became a noteworthy three-point shooter as well. After playing with the Sonics for 9 years, going to 7 All-Star games, and bringing the team its first championship, Sikma, after retiring, would eventually return to Seattle as an assistant coach from 2003 to 2007, before he was eventually let go by the devil himself in the form of Clay Bennett. At number 9, Bobby Wagner. Drafted in the second round of the 2012 NFL Draft with the 47th overall pick, Wagner is going into his 9th year at linebacker for the Seattle Seahawks. And yes, for Wagner, it has only been 8 years so far, but oh, what an 8 years it has been. In his first few years, he was a little bit overshadowed by some of his co-workers, who were a little bit more outspoken and had a penchant for making somewhat flashier plays, a group known to most as the Legion of Boom. But make no mistake, Bobby was still a great player right from the jump. In his rookie year, all he managed to do was accrue 140 combined tackles and 3 interceptions, and those 140 tackles were good enough for 7th in the league. And even though he did somehow miss the Pro Bowl that year, it is pretty difficult to make the Pro Bowl unless of course you are a first-round pick. But it is also not something that he would make a habit of doing, as he would go to his first Pro Bowl in 2014 in his 3rd season in the NFL, as well as being selected as a first-team All-Pro. And he hasn't missed a Pro Bowl since, with what is now 6 and counting trips to the game, as well as now being a 5-time first-team All-Pro, only missing in 2015 when he was a second-team All-Pro. Throughout his career, he has been an absolute tackling machine, never once in his 8 years failing to reach 100 tackles, and has been top 10 in tackles 5 times, including leading the league in 2016 with 167 and in 2019 with 159. And he did also lead the league in solo tackles in 2017 with 97, and has already totaled over 1,000 tackles in his career, which is good enough for 66th all-time going into the 2020 season. And even with the other elite defensive talent that surrounded him in his early years with the Seahawks either retiring or leaving Seattle altogether, he has maintained or even improved year after year. And I don't think it's a stretch to say that if his career does go even just a few more years at anywhere near the pace that it's gone right now, he is a lock for the Hall of Fame and one of the best Seahawks of all time. At number 8, I have King Felix, and of the players on this list, he is the only one in my opinion whom there is still some question whether or not he'll make the Hall of Fame if he isn't there already, some of which is due to the difficulty of making the Hall of Fame in baseball, but regardless of that, there is no question of his impact on the Seattle Mariners organization. Felix made his debut for the Mariners in 2005 at just 19 years old, and in 12 starts he had an ERA well under 3 and a WHIP under 1, which is a pretty good way to start your career. And by 2009 he had started to establish himself as one of the best pitchers in all of baseball, that year having a league best 19 wins, an ERA of 2.49, and his first 200-plus strikeout season. It was a performance that earned him his first trip to an All-Star game, and also saw him finish second in Cy Young voting. And in the 6 years that followed, he had another 5 consecutive seasons of 200 or more strikeouts, for a total of 6 years in a row. In that span, only having a WHIP above 1.2 once, a cumulative ERA below 3, and pitched over 1,300 innings, averaging nearly 7 innings per pitch in 196 starts from 2010 to 2015, and only missed the All-Star game once for a total of 6 trips in his career. Oh, and that one year he did miss the All-Star game in 2010, all he did was lead all of baseball with a 2.27 ERA over an AL best 249 and 2/3 innings pitched, with 232 strikeouts, and an AL best 7 hits per 9, with a WHIP just above 1. All of which leading to a, albeit somewhat surprising, but definitely very well-deserved Cy Young award. And really the only reason it was surprising, and probably also had something to do with why he didn't make the All-Star game by the midseason break, was that he only managed to have 13 wins to 12 losses in that season. And really the only reason it was that surprising, and probably part of the reason he didn't make the All-Star game by the midseason break, is because he only had 13 wins in the season, and had 12 losses, mostly because the majority of that Mariners team around him was a special kind of terrible. It also goes to further prove the point of just how stupid the win stat is for a pitcher, especially when it comes to thinking about how good he is. Statistically though, probably his best season came in 2014, when he had an AL leading ERA of 2.14, and an AL leading 6.5 hits per 9, as well as a ridiculous WHIP of .915, which also was leading on the entire American League. It was certainly a performance that probably should have earned him his second Cy Young award, but for some reason he didn't. He ended up finishing second. Felix's last few years in Seattle were marred by injury and a declining fastball, and unfortunately for some, this seemed to taint their view of him and what he meant to the franchise. Mostly because there was a perception that he was just unwilling to adapt to his aging arm. But even aside from all the ridiculous stats he put up in his prime, and the fact that during that time he was one of the best pitchers in all of baseball, Felix's meaning to the Mariners goes well beyond anything that you can find on a stat sheet. For most of his career, and especially after Ichiro left, Felix was the face of the franchise. And Felix Day, as well as the King's Court that went along with it, were often the most exciting and clearly most well-attended games of those Mariners seasons. And that isn't to say that there weren't some other stars. Obviously, Robinson Cano came to town, and Nelson Cruz also played a few years in Seattle. But in both of those cases, a large part of the reason that they came to play for the Mariners was Felix Hernandez convincing them to do so. And especially in the case of Robinson Cano, it must have been some kind of sales job. I mean, sure, the amount of money the Mariners paid him probably had quite a bit to do with it as well, but it's not like the Mariners were a team with a history of, let's just say, a whole lot of success, especially at that time. and Cano was leaving the Yankees and could have gone any number of other places if he had wanted to. But it wasn't just that Felix helped convince other stars to come to the team. In his prime, the Mariners were really bad for a lot of those years, and he had multiple opportunities to have just left in free agency and gone to a contender. But he wanted desperately to win and do it in Seattle. It was that outspoken love for the team and passion for the game that he frequently wore on his sleeve that endeared him to the fans of the Seattle Mariners for the 15 years that he spent here. Oh, and you probably thought I was going to forget, but there is also this, which he is still the last player to have done.
The Seattle Mariners, Felix Hernandez, the 2-2. He got him! 34 years, 119 games. It's finally happened. A perfect game by a Seattle Mariner. It was done by the King.
At number 7, Hall of Famer Walter Jones. Drafted 6th overall in 1997, Jones played his entire 12-year career in Seattle and is one of the best tackles in the history of the NFL. If there is one position group in all of sports that it is difficult to prove the greatness of a player using stats, it is definitely offensive line. And that's not to say there aren't some advanced stats and other metrics that are used to show a player's performance, especially more recently, but anyway. If you do want a more simple way to look at how good an offensive lineman is, though, you can always look at the stats of the running backs that they blocked for. And obviously that can have as much to do with the running back as the line that's blocking for him, but I think you can see pretty clearly from the guys that Walter Jones was blocking for that he definitely made a pretty big difference. To start off his career with the late 90s and early 2000 Seahawks, Jones was blocking for Ricky Watters, who in that time had 3 consecutive 1,200-yard seasons. A 3-year span that was followed immediately by 5 years of blocking for Sean Alexander, who in that time ranged anywhere from almost 1,200 yards to almost 1,900 yards. A couple of stats, though, that are all his own are the 9 Pro Bowl appearances he had and the 6 All-Pro nominations. Throughout his career, Jones was widely considered to be one of the best offensive linemen in the NFL, maybe even in the history of the NFL. Even at one point having head coach Mike Holmgren say that he was the best offensive player he had ever coached, which is saying quite a lot from an old quarterback coach who had coached guys like Joe Montana, Steve Young, and Brett Favre. Since his retirement, he was elected into the Hall of Fame and had his number 71 retired by the Seahawks, and still remains a strong supporter of the team. At number 6, Hall of Famer Gary the Glove Payton. Drafted in 1990 with the 2nd overall pick, he played 13 years with the Sonics in Seattle while establishing himself as one of the best all-around point guards the NBA has ever seen. It took him a while to get going, but by his 4th season in the NBA, he was nearly in full form, averaging 16.5 points, 2.3 steals, and 6 assists per game, all while shooting over 500 and earning his way to the first of what would be 9 All-Star appearances, all in Seattle. And over the 9 years that followed in Seattle, he only failed to average over 20 points per game twice, and had over 8 assists per game in that span, including an NBA leading number of assists in the 1999 to 2000 season, many of those lobbed up to co-star Shawn Kemp to throw down. But while he was a very good and effective offensive player, what he was best known for was defense, as in my mind, he is the best defensive point guard in the history of the NBA. A fact that was never more obvious than it was in the 1995 to 96 NBA season, a year in which he led the entire league in steals and became the first and still only point guard in the history of the NBA to win Defensive Player of the Year, all while leading the Sonics and their second best league defense to the NBA Finals. Unfortunately for Payton, Kemp, and the rest of that Sonics team, they ran into maybe the best team of all time in the 1995-96 Chicago Bulls. And although they did unfortunately end up falling to the Bulls in that series, they still did take them to 6 games. And Gary Payton, who had the unenviable task of guarding Michael Jordan throughout that series, held him to his worst shooting percentage and points per game in any of his 6 NBA Finals appearances. And it's a series that Jordan has even said was the toughest of the 6 championships that he won. Payton would eventually leave Seattle towards the end of the 2002-2003 season in a trade for Ray Allen, and would play on 4 teams over the remaining 4+ years of his career, eventually winning a championship in Miami. And he would eventually retire in 2007, a 9-time All-Star, 9-time All-Defensive NBA player, and a 9-time All-NBA player. He now sits 9th all-time in assists, 4th all-time in steals, and among point guards, 4th all-time in scoring, and was an easy choice for first ballot Hall of Fame. And since this list is about Seattle sports, it's well worth mentioning and consideration that since the team was stolen and moved to OKC, he has remained a strong supporter of basketball in Seattle and getting a team back here, as well as being a very strong voice against the move before it even happened. And he has made it very clear that he does not want his number 20 retired in OKC because that is not the team that he played on. At number 5, Ichiro Suzuki. Ichiro signed with the Mariners in 2001 out of Japan, where he had proved himself to be one of the best players that league had ever seen. In spite of that, however, due to his size and being among the first Japanese position players in the MLB, there was still a lot of skepticism around how good he could actually be. And after spring training of that first season, it seemed like there was good reason for all the skepticism, as it did not go well for Ichiro. But then, due to an injury to an aging Jay Buhner, Ichiro was forced into a starting role in right field for the Seattle Mariners in 2001 as a rookie. And really, it was a 2001 Mariners team that had as many questions and as much skepticism surrounding it as their new Japanese right fielder, especially after having lost superstars Ken Griffey Jr. and Alex Rodriguez in the years leading up to 2001. But I think we all know what happened next. The 2001 Mariners went on to win an MLB record-tying 116 games in the regular season, and all Ichiro did was lead all of the AL with a batting average of .350, as well as leading the AL in plate appearances, at-bats, stolen bases, and hits, falling just 15 short of George Sisler's single-season hit record, which had stood since 1920. In one season, Ichiro went from being an unknown that many thought wouldn't be able to succeed in the US to being an MVP and Rookie of the Year, becoming just the second player to win both awards in the same season, as well as winning a Gold Glove and a Silver Slugger award in that 2001 year. And over the next 9 years, Ichiro did not slow down, as in his first 10 years in his MLB career, Ichiro went to 10 consecutive All-Star games, won 10 Gold Gloves, 3 Silver Sluggers, 2 batting titles, hit .310 or better every year in that span, and accrued 200 hits or more all 10 seasons, including leading all of baseball in hits in 7 of those seasons. Oh yeah, and as for that single season hit record that he had fallen just short of in 2001, well, 3 years later...
And a ground ball back up the middle, and there it is! He's a new all-time hit king in Major League history, number 258. My, oh my!
Ichiro would eventually leave the Mariners in the middle of the 2012 season, and played the next 5.5 years of his career with the Yankees and then Marlins, where he would eventually get his 3,000th career hit in the MLB. He did eventually return to the Mariners for the starts of the 2018 and 2019 seasons, eventually retiring after the second game of the 2019 season in Japan, where they were playing against the Oakland A's to start the year. In the end, Ichiro accrued 3,089 hits in the MLB on top of the 1,278 hits that he had in his pro career in Japan before coming to the US. In his time in Seattle with the Mariners, Ichiro established himself as one of the greatest hitters in the history of baseball, helped out by his ability to frequently turn what would normally be a routine groundout into an infield hit. And on top of that, as evidenced by his 10 Gold Gloves, he was just as good in the field as he was at the plate, frequently taking hits away from opposing batters as well as home runs. Oh, and don't forget, you don't run on Ichiro.
Ground ball, base hit in the right field. Heading for third is Terrence Long. The throw by Ichiro. Beautiful. Peggy got him. Holy smoke, a laser beam strike from Ichiro.
At number 4, Steve Largent. Drafted 117th overall in the 4th round of the 1976 draft by the Oilers, Largent is the only player on this list that did not start in Seattle. But with that said, after 4 preseason games in Houston, he was set to be cut by the Oilers, but instead was traded to the expansion Seattle Seahawks for an 8th round pick. In the Seahawks' first season as a franchise and his rookie season, Largent led the team in receptions with 54 and yards with 705. And although the next year he did just have 643 receiving yards, it was still good enough to lead the team for the second consecutive year, and keep in mind this was at a time in the NFL where 870 yards led the league that year. But after that, with the exception of the 1982 shortened season due to a players' strike, Largent hit over 1,000 yards in each of the next 9 seasons. And his 1,287 yards in the 1985 season is still a franchise record in a single season for the Seattle Seahawks. And he did all this while never really being one of the faster receivers in the NFL, even at that time. And at 5'11", he certainly wasn't one of the bigger receivers either. Instead, his success was due to his agility and incredible route running, which he is still one of the best all-time at. By the end of his career, he had been to 7 Pro Bowls, including being the first Seahawk ever to go to a Pro Bowl in 1978, and was selected 5 times as an All-Pro player, and did also win the 1988 Walter Payton Man of the Year award. On top of that though, at the time of his retirement, Largent held NFL records for receptions with 819, yards with 13,089, and touchdowns with 100. Also held the record for consecutive games with a reception with 177, and was considered to be the greatest wide receiver ever. Of course though, as we now know, none of those records and the title of greatest receiver of all time did not hold up for a particularly long period of time, because when he did retire, there was a particularly exciting young receiver who was just in his 3rd season in the NFL that went by the name of Jerry Rice. Today he is still 18th all-time in yards, with Jason Witten really close to passing him if we do get an NFL season in 2020, as well as still being 9th all-time in touchdowns. In 1995, Largent would become a first-ballot Hall of Famer, just 3 years after having his number 80 be the first one retired for a player by the Seattle Seahawks. And it's a number that has only been worn once since then, with Largent's permission, when Seattle Seahawk great Jerry Rice came to town in 2004. But in spite of all of his accomplishments and accolades as a receiver, with all of those yards and touchdowns caught, his favorite play of his career, and probably to this day the one that he's most well remembered for, is a hit that he laid on Denver Broncos DB Mike Harden, born out of revenge for a dirty hit that happened earlier the very same year.
Oh, and Largent unloaded and got the ball. Holy cow, what a shot!
At number 3, Edgar Martinez. And of all the players on this list, Edgar certainly has the most unique story of how he ended up coming to play in Seattle. At the suggestion of his semi-pro team's owner, he tried out for the Mariners in 1982. And although even he admits that he nearly didn't even go to the tryout after having a late night at the factory job that he had at the time the day before, he still did end up going to the tryout and got an offer from the Mariners. Although, after considering turning down that offer from the Mariners due to the amount of money he was going to sign for and how much he was already making, he was eventually convinced to accept and signed with the Mariners at the age of 19. But after signing, it took him 5 years before he even debuted for the Mariners, and even at that, it took him another 2 years before he got a starting role, which he kind of struggled at and was sent back down to the minors. He finally joined the Mariners as a full-time player in 1990 as a backup third baseman, but was quickly promoted after a 5-error game by the starter. And from there, he shined, especially with his bat. Over the next 12 years, he only failed to hit over 300 twice, winning 2 batting titles, the first of which in 1992 came in a season where his .343 batting average and 46 doubles led all of baseball. With a couple of major injuries early on in his career, Edgar was eventually moved from third base to full-time DH, which only served to reinvigorate his bat, winning his second batting title in 1995, when he led all of the AL in runs and batting average, which his .356 batting average was a franchise record at that time, although it was eventually broken by Ichiro. In that same 1995 season, though, he also led all of baseball in doubles with 52, as well as on base percentage and OPS. Again though, with Edgar's 1995 campaign, his performance had a lot more meaning than just the stats that show up on the sheet, as at the time the Mariners were struggling to get funding for a new stadium in order to keep the team in Seattle. And as far as that's concerned, going into the year, honestly, things didn't look good, especially with the team still having never made a playoff series. And then midway through the year when they lost their superstar center fielder, it looked like it might take a miracle in order to keep the team in Seattle. But it was thanks in huge part to Edgar Martinez's bat that the Mariners managed to stay within striking distance until Griffey got back, and then made a push to win the AL West with a game 163 against the Angels. And then with a final public vote looming on whether or not the Mariners were going to get funding for a new stadium, the team battled back from a 2-0 series deficit to the Yankees, thanks in large part again to Edgar Martinez's hitting. In that series, Edgar had a .571 batting average and a ridiculous 1.667 OPS, and near as is possible, single-handedly won them Game 4 with his 7 RBIs and 2 home runs, including a grand slam that broke a 6-6 tie in the 8th inning.
And here comes the 2-2 pitch to Edgar Martinez now, and the fastball swung on and hit the deep center field. Bernie Williams goes back, and it is get out the rye bread and the mustard this time, Grandma. It is a grand salami, and the Mariners lead it 10-6. I don't believe it. My, oh my.
And of course, it was Edgar's bat that delivered the double in the 11th inning of Game 5 to walk off the Yankees, win the series, and probably save baseball in the city of Seattle.
Love a base hit into the gap, and they could win it with Junior speed to stretch. And the 0-1 pitch on the way to Edgar Martinez. Swung on and lined down the left field line for a base hit. Here comes Joy. Here is Junior to third base. They're going to wave him in. The throw to the plate will be late. The Mariners are going to play for the American League Championship. I don't believe it. It just continues. My, oh my. Edgar Martinez with a double.
Edgar eventually retired at the end of the 2004 season, winning 5 Silver Sluggers in his career and going to 7 All-Star games, including 2003 at the age of 40. In his 18 seasons, all with the Seattle Mariners, Edgar had a career batting average of .312, 5 seasons of an OPS over 1,000, and a career OPS of .933. And just for a little reference for just how good that is, the league average tends to hover somewhere around .750. Oh, and as if all of that wasn't impressive enough, he did the majority of it while struggling with an eye condition that affected his depth perception. It was a career that eventually led in 2004 to the award for the best DH each year being renamed to the Edgar Martinez Award. He would also eventually have his number 11 retired by the Seattle Mariners in 2017, and then finally making the Hall of Fame in 2019, becoming the first DH primary player in the Hall. And throughout the years leading up to that Hall of Fame induction, a number of the best pitchers from his time in baseball, who also made it into the Hall of Fame, from Pedro Martinez to Mariano Rivera, all said that Edgar was easily the toughest hitter that they had ever faced. And of course, he holds a substantial number of Mariners franchise records, including games played with 2,055 games. And after a number of years of being a hitting consultant in the minors, eventually returned to the Major League squad as the hitting coach for a couple of seasons. And after all that, I'm only going to say this once, and I know Red Sox fans aren't probably going to like hearing this, but Edgar Martinez is the greatest DH of all time. At number 2, Russell Wilson. Drafted 75th overall in the 3rd round of the 2012 NFL Draft, Russell, in his 8 years, has, in my eyes, already cemented himself as the greatest Seahawk of all time. Now, I know it's only been 8 years, and unlike Largent, Russell isn't, at least quite yet, in the conversation for best at his position of all time, but he still is definitely one of the best players going right now in a time where there are a number of great quarterbacks. And he does play the most important position in all of sports. He does share one thing in common with Largent, though, that is, outside of playing for the best team in all of football. And that is being 5'11", and having his size used against him by doubters before his career got started. But it is because of his size, probably also like Largent, that he ever even played for the Seahawks in the first place. It is his lack of prototypical QB size in the NFL that saw him slip all the way to the 3rd round, where the Seahawks could draft him. But even in spite of that, and being drafted onto a team that had just signed a free agent quarterback for $15 million, he still managed to win the starting role as a rookie. And of course, there are plenty of quarterbacks that start as rookies, but it's not very common that one starts as a rookie that was drafted in the 3rd round. But that is just what he did, starting all 16 games of that first year and throwing for an NFL rookie record tying 26 touchdowns, as well as taking a team that had come off back-to-back 7-9 seasons to an 11-5 finish and a wildcard berth into the playoffs. And although the Seahawks were eventually knocked out of those playoffs by the Falcons, he did also get elected to the Pro Bowl. And since then, he still has yet to miss a single start, has only failed to make the playoffs once, and has only failed to win at least 10 games once. Although that being said, in 2017, when the Seahawks did go 9-7 and miss the playoffs, it certainly had nothing to do with Russell Wilson's effort, as in that season, he accounted, whether it was passing or rushing it himself, for 81% of the Seahawks' total yards, and all but one of their 38 offensive touchdowns. throwing for a league-high 34 touchdowns, and rushing for another 3. And with that Seahawks team losing at least 3 games due to missed field goals by Blair Walsh, I don't think it's a stretch to say that they certainly would have made the playoffs with a competent kicker, and there's a decent chance that Russell would have won the MVP considering all that he did had they won the division and made the playoffs. But we'll never know. At this point, Russell holds pretty much every Seahawks franchise record for passing that there is. Well, all of the good ones anyway. And I say that because for as good as he is at throwing to his receivers, which by completion percentage he is among the best year after year, he is equally good at not throwing it to the opponent's players. Throwing an interception on just 1.8% of the passes that he throws, which is the same exact percentage that Tom Brady has going into the 2020 season. But how he's managed to get all these stats is almost as impressive as the stats themselves, having to do most of it behind incredibly porous pass blocking, especially lately, and having to constantly make things up and make something out of nothing. And of course, if he doesn't find anyone to pass it to in those situations, he has no problem just taking off himself, with nearly 4,000 career rushing yards to this point, even leading the team in rushing and rushing touchdowns in 2017. And the stat that Russell has been most dominant in throughout his career is the most important one: wins. Now, of course, wins are not purely a quarterback stat by any means, especially in the NFL, but quarterback is still very much the most important position on the field. And when it comes to the fourth quarter, I can't think of a quarterback I would more want to have on my team than Russell Wilson. I also think it's worth mentioning that even though I think guys like Doug Baldwin and Tyler Lockett have been criminally underrated throughout their careers, Russell has done all of this without having somebody that is considered to be an elite receiver in the NFL. And as far as his impact on the NFL and the game of football as a whole goes, it's due in large part to Russell Wilson's success, especially considering his size, that has paved the way for a new generation of smaller, more mobile quarterbacks to succeed, including first overall picks Baker Mayfield and Kyler Murray, who certainly wouldn't be have chosen where they were if it wasn't for Russell Wilson. Not to mention a number of other teams also looking for mobility in their new quarterbacks, like Lamar Jackson and Patrick Mahomes. Oh yeah, and let's not forget that even with an elite defense, he did take the Seahawks to back-to-back Super Bowls and won them their first Lombardi trophy in just his second season in the NFL. But maybe what's most impressive about Russell Wilson's career to this point is that even after all of this, he still hasn't received a single MVP vote. At number 1, Hall of Famer, Ken Griffey Jr. Drafted first overall by the Mariners in the 1987 MLB draft, Jr. quickly worked his way to the majors, starting with the Mariners in the 1989 season at the age of 19. From the moment he stepped on the field, it was clear that Griffey was going to be a great player in baseball, and eventually became one of the best players the baseball has ever seen. As far as stats go with Griffey, there are just too many to mention, and especially with this video already going pretty long, I could have spent an entire video's length just talking about that. So instead, I'll just give you a few highlights. As you probably know, his 630 home runs are 7th all time, and that is including the guys that may or may not have gotten there legitimately. In his career, he had 2 seasons with 56 home runs, 7 seasons with 40 or more home runs, and another 2 seasons with 30 or more. And in his time with the Mariners alone, he had 417 home runs, including leading the American League in 4 seasons. His 1,836 RBIs are good for 16th all time, again behind a few people that might have had some help. This also includes 8 seasons, 7 with the Mariners, in which he had over 100 RBIs, and in 1997 led all of baseball with 147. He also hit over 300 in 8 seasons and had a career batting average of .284, and a Mariners career average of .292, even including those last 2 years at the end of his career that could have been better. And as far as other awards go, he was a 13-time All-Star, 10 of those coming with the Mariners, a 10-time Gold Glover, 7-time Silver Slugger, and the 1997 MVP. All of that coming with the Mariners as well. For Griffey, what shows up on the stat sheet is certainly one of the biggest reasons that he's considered to be one of the greatest players of all time. But like all the other guys on this list, it certainly does not tell the full story, especially in his case. For Griffey, a large part of the allure and part of what made him such a big star was that he always played the game full out, which for him pretty much always meant making incredible catches, whether they were robbing home runs, Spider-Manning up the wall, or just diving all over the place in the outfield. And when it came to hitting, lots and lots of home runs, with one of, if not the prettiest swing that baseball has ever seen.
And everybody else. Well hit ball, there it goes! Number 350 for Junior! What a career at the age of 28.
But it wasn't even just that. It was also the fact that he seemed to always show up, or at least make the most of pretty much all the big moments that he came across. Whether it was a double in his first at-bat, a home run with his first swing in Seattle, back-to-back home runs with his dad, which they're still the only pair to ever do, and honestly I can't see that ever changing. Hitting a ball off of the warehouse in right field in Baltimore in the 1993 Home Run Derby, hitting a home run in the final game in the Kingdom, and then ending that game by robbing a home run, or even hitting his 500th home run on Father's Day with his dad sitting front row in the stands. And as if all of that weren't enough, he did everything with an incredible charisma and fun-loving love for the game that spread to everybody that he played with, and also inspired an entire generation of kids like me who looked up to him and wanted to have as much fun playing the game as he did. And for what it's worth, on a personal level, even though he's clearly the best player to me that has ever played in Seattle, he was also my favorite player growing up and my childhood hero. Plus, he's the reason that I hit left-handed growing up playing baseball, even though I am right-handed. Now, I know that pretty much means nothing, especially considering my baseball prowess pretty much ended in 7th grade, but he also inspired the entire generation, including guys like Mike Trout, for example. And don't get me wrong, I love watching Russell Wilson and what he's done for the Seahawks, including bringing us a Lombardi Trophy and the first championship in my lifetime in Seattle. But coming from what is traditionally seen as a smaller market and being shoved up in the corner away from everyone else, Seattle tends to not get a whole lot of media attention, and while Russell Wilson and the Seahawks have had their fair share of attention over the last few years and during his career, nothing has compared to what Griffey did during his, being pretty much not just the face of the Mariners, but the face of baseball for a large portion of his career. Something that Seattle sports hadn't seen to that point and really hasn't seen since. He just made baseball a game that to a lot of people is just kind of slow and at times rigid fun. He made wearing a hat backwards look cool, in spite of getting death threats over doing it. He never flipped his bat, but in spite of that still has one of the most iconic home run swings and poses of all time. And he is the reason that players all over the league wear the number 42 on Jackie Robinson Day. I don't think there's any way for me to overstate the impact that Griffey had on the game of baseball, especially after the 1994 strike that ended the season early and how much that hurt the game's popularity as a whole. But as far as Seattle itself is concerned, he straight up saved baseball in Seattle. I know we talked about earlier with Edgar how much of an impact he had on that season, especially after Griffey missed a huge chunk of it with a broken wrist after flying into the center field wall. And Griffey did score the winning run of that 1995 division series against the Yankees that, again, probably was the nail in the coffin to saving Seattle's baseball team. But honestly, I don't even think that magical 1995 season and that incredible divisional series would have been quite enough to save the franchise if it hadn't have been for the years of Griffey's best of all time level play, incredible personality, and his national and maybe even global level of fame, and the attention that over time brought to the team. And after all, there is a very good reason that T-Mobile Park's nickname is the house that Griffey built. And honestly, there's so much more I could talk about with Griffey, and I've probably left off some pretty important things. But like I said at the beginning, there's only so much time I can devote to this, and this video's already gone pretty long, so I'll probably just have to save that for a future video. But if you can think of any of your favorite Griffey moments or things I might have left out, please do leave those down in the comment section below. I'd love to hear about it. But with that said, once again, Ken Griffey Jr. is the best player to ever play for a professional sports team in the city of Seattle. And with that, as always, if you have made it to this point, thank you very much for watching this video and sticking with me to this point. This video did take quite a long time to put together, much more than most of mine do, so I appreciate you getting this far. And once again, if you did like this video, it would mean a lot if you hit that like button down below and hit subscribe if you really like this video. And if you have any other thoughts on players I've left off of this list or things about these players that I may have left off, do leave those also down in the comment section below. Until next time, stay safe out there and be good to each other. Peace.